talking about phenology for beekeepers. It's the first phenology program I've had this year. I love phenology, and I hope to share with you some really practical ways that you can understand and use phenology in whatever you're doing. You're beekeeping, you're gardening, maybe you're also farming or you're a naturalist. There are a lot of really wonderful practical ways to use phenology. Let me start with these guys. So these are my Zoom mates. And Zoe on the left is very seasoned. She's been Zooming ever since I've been Zooming, so as long as the pandemic happened. Jasper on the right is pretty new. He's just 12 months, but he's been through a half a dozen baby Zoom sessions and has done really great. So he is in the Zoom room tonight, and so far so good. But if I have to pause quickly and call my husband, he is on demand to come up and rescue us from Jasper if he gets a little frisky. So phenology for beekeepers and all other naturalists, that's what we're talking about tonight. So I am with the Department of Entomology at OSU, the insect department, where I focus on pollinator education. I've been here in entomology for about a dozen years, but before that, for about 18 years, I was a county extension educator focusing on horticulture, integrated pest management, natural resources in the county. And so one of my programs and really areas of passion is has been phenology for a long time. So we're going to talk a little bit about how OSU developed our phenology calendar. Maybe some of you have used it. If not, by the end of our session here, you'll be familiar with it, how you can try to adapt it for where you are there in Kentucky, but learn about the succession of bloom, how we use phenology, and how that could make sense for you as a beekeeper. So I did put the notes from tonight's program, except for two slides that I just threw in at the beginning. Here at this quick link, let me see, and maybe April or Macy, you can throw it in the chat box so folks can click on that later. You'll have that on your computer. It's just a handout that shows all those slides. So if there's something you wanted to look back at or you missed, you can have access to that. So we're lucky with honeybees in a way with phenology. So phenology is the succession of biological activity through the season, and we're going to talk about mostly bloom phenology. For a lot of insects, we can use phenology, but not so much for honeybee as far as their development goes. We're going to talk about that as we go. But beekeepers, as I present this idea of phenology, it really kind of lights a fire on what you're already doing. You're observing plants, you're watching your girls bring back in pollen and nectar, and looking at what's in bloom around you. And so this is a way that you can kind of expand that to get a sense of what's going on there in your local environment. Of course, we know that bees are central place foragers. Here's a bumblebee that had a little radar tracker glued on her abdomen or on her thorax. And then she was tracked as she flew around this landscape looking for flowers and flying back to the hive. So we're lucky that honeybees are central place foragers, and as are other bees, they're coming back to that central place, right? We know that they're working plants in that environment. If there are lots of plants in bloom close by, they're going to stay close by. But if they have to go further, they will, but always coming back to that central place. What that means for us with phenology is that if you think of a bee's eye view of your apiary or your home or your farm, wherever your bees are, they're starting off in that central place and they're flying out from there. We usually say a mile, maybe a mile and a half or two, depends how hungry they are and how many flower resources they can find. So even though you don't have some of these plants that we're going to talk about close by, they certainly could be in the cemetery, in the fence row, at the school garden, other areas nearby where your bees are going. So this is almost the best time to talk about phenology. My very favorite month to teach about phenology, based on what's happening here in Ohio, it would be a little earlier for you down there, is March, because there's not a lot happening here in Ohio. I'm kind of in Northeast Ohio. Not a lot happening outside in March. It's pretty frozen, not many buds swollen. Certainly nothing is really green or growing. That may be different for where you are in the state, but we're ready for green, right? We're ready for things to get going, and so people are really primed to learn about phenology. The absolute worst time for me to teach this is July and August because you're kind of done with the gardening and growing season. There's not a lot of things still blooming that are not annuals, and it just kind of falls flat. So this is almost the best time to learn about phenology because there's nothing blooming. Things are maybe not frozen; they're kind of squishy out back for me. But the spring hasn't sprung yet. So one of the ways that I know spring is coming is when we see the return of turkey vultures, although, that seems to be changing a little bit with climate change. They seem to be hanging out a little more through the winter, and that may be, definitely the case where you are. But that return of the turkey vulture is one of the ways that I know spring is coming. Also, the return of the red-winged blackbird, the male setting up his territory, giving that distinctive call. That's when I know that if I go to Quail Hollow Park, which is in Stark County, close to me here, I may see this plant in bloom. This is skunk cabbage, right? And we can see that the ground is frozen around it. This is a great wetland plant, doesn't mind being, in water. It can definitely take ice and snow around it all winter, but it metabolizes and melts that ice and comes up to bloom. So one of the first plants that your honeybees are likely bringing back pollen from, it's kind of a light greenish yellow pollen. So be thinking of that when you see your girls coming in. It seems too early for, many other things to be in bloom, but it could be skunk cabbage. So this is really, one of the easiest ways for me to talk about what phenology is. It's the coincidence of these two events. So red-winged blackbirds start to set up their territory for nesting, and skunk cabbage is in bloom. And so, and that's really what it is, kind of using one thing to remind us that another thing is happening. And we're going to talk about ways that you can create or craft your own phenology calendar based on your interests and what you see around you. Here's one of my favorite very early blooming plants, not a wildflower. Well, it's a wildflower, but it's not a native wildflower. This coltsfoot, and you can see this honeybee here on the coltsfoot. As a little girl, I grew up in the Laurel Highlands in Western Pennsylvania, and this is the plant that told me that spring was coming to the mountain. It's slow, right, depending on your elevation. If you're down in the valley, spring comes a little faster. The further up you go, the slower it is for spring to find you. And so when I finally would see the coltsfoot in bloom, I'd know that spring was on its way up the mountain. So we're talking about phenology and not phrenology. So phrenology is the pseudoscience that says that whatever the bumps are on your scalp, your head, indicate some of your qualities, good and bad. Are you honest? Are you faithful? Are you murderous, etc.? It was a pseudoscience. So a lot of times people will say, or my spell check will try to put phrenology in there. So we're not going to be manipulating our heads today. We're not talking about phrenology. We're talking about phenology. So phenology is the study of what shows or appears. So as I said, these kind of these cyclical events, these biological events in nature, and how they are influenced by weather and climate. Okay, so I like to think of weather as what you wore today. For us here in Northeast Ohio, actually got to like 48 degrees, probably was even warmer for you. So what I wore today was just a hoodie. Climate is about your wardrobe. So, have my winter clothes there up front in the closet, hoping to have a real winter. So we're talking about not just weather, but also climate with phenology. And there are lots of different ways to think about phenology. If you're a birder, you probably have a list of birds that you see every year. And some people are really having fun with this. When's my first sighting of a cardinal, of a mallard? It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but which birds do I see when? And we definitely have a sequence of whether you're tracking waterfowl or songbirds or what have you, a sequence of appearance for those migrating birds or even birds that are nesting close by. Maybe you're watching for spotted salamanders, and so you're tracking amphibian activity or tracking frog calls. There are many natural events that we can kind of think of which call do we hear first, and then which one, and which one after that. And that sequence is really the same from year to year. So maybe you're tracking wildflowers and which wildflowers bloom before bloodroot and which bloom after bloodroot. And even if we have a warm spring and things seem to go really quickly, that sequence stays the same. In our human world, we can think about what we wear when. Do you have your winter wardrobe out yet? Have you switched over to spring? Which foods are we seeing in the produce section? Of course, we have a global economy, so we're seeing fruits that are grown in different parts of the world in different seasons. But still we're in citrus season right now, and then we'll move into strawberries, and then there'll be apples, and I guess apples will be blooming, won't be apples yet. But you get my point that there is kind of this natural sequence of food that we find in the grocery store. My husband is not fond of I used to have two labs, and so he knew the phenology of shed season, right? He could tell when shedding was happening, and it actually comes kind of end of winter before the spring, based on the hair that he was seeing around the house. Jasper, my new pup, doesn't shed, which is really exciting for my husband, so something to consider. So the origins of phenology, when humans live together as hunter-gatherers, we need to pay attention. We need to look around us, realize what's blooming, what the weather is like, what's happening around us, and time our activity based on what we're seeing. So is it time to harvest those nuts or to dig those tubers or move to the next location because the migrating mammals will be coming through, right? So we survive by paying attention and following that kind of sequence from year to year, passing that down through first oral, then written traditions. In early agriculture, certainly we use phenology all the time in agriculture, and some of the, Farmer's Almanac or Old Wives' Tales are linked to phenology and the practices that we use and what time of year. And so, if in early agriculture, particularly, seeds were very scarce and very valuable. And if we planted our corn seed too early and we get another freeze or the soil is flooded, the seed is destroyed, then we suffer, right? We don't have food to feed our family or our tribe. If we wait too long to plant those seeds, then maybe we don't get to harvest what we would have otherwise. And so looking around, making observation, passing that on from generation to generation really ensure the success of those agricultural practices. So the reason I have the oak leaf here pictured in this slide talking about the origins of phenology is maybe you have heard this about when to plant corn seeds. So you plant your corn when the oak leaves are as big as a squirrel's ear. Now, the squirrels in your backyard may have smaller or bigger ears than those in my backyard, but the idea is the same, that those leaves haven't pushed out yet. It's still pretty early in the season for the oaks, but those buds are open and the leaves are starting to emerge. And that's the timing, then the soil's warm enough that you can take the chance of putting those corn seeds in the ground. So there's Mother Nature's calendar and there's our human calendar. And where our human calendar goes wrong is saying something like on St. Patrick's Day, you can plant, what do you plant? Do you plant peas or onion sets or potatoes on St. Patrick's Day? Well, if you go on Facebook or some other social media site, you see that people are doing that in my sister in Fresno, California, my brother in Titusville, Florida, and me here in Northeast Ohio. We're all thinking that we can plant peas on St. Patrick's Day. And obviously, Fresno, Titusville, and Worcester, Ohio, very different weather-wise. So those calendar recommendations not so useful. And here we have the Groundhog Day telling us whether or not we have 6 more weeks of winter. Calendar's not the most reliable way, but Mother Nature's calendar, those natural activities are going to unfold in the same sequence every year. So some of the ways we use phenology in our folklore, we may plant lettuce, spinach, peas, broccoli, and cabbage when the lilacs show their first leaves or when daffodils begin to bloom. And that's true for you in Kentucky, me in Ohio, my friend who lives in Toronto, right? So if our phenological clues are the same, then that activity should be the same wherever we are. Plant cucumbers and squash when lilac flowers fade, so we're moving further into the spring. Plant tomatoes, early corn, and peppers when dogwood are in peak bloom or when daylilies start to bloom, so again, further into the spring. So there are lots and lots of phenological associations that have made their way into gardening folklore and have a lot of good practice behind them. So I don't know if Kentucky's changed their name and extension, but we've changed lots of times here in my career at OSU. We used to be called the Ohio Cooperative Extension Service, and in the old days, most of our specialists were in Columbus, the center of the state. They were doing research on, say, insect activity, and they would write fact sheets that we, Xeroxed and handed out. People loved that at the fair and what have you. Um, and the fact sheet might say to control corn earworm, let's say, spray this pesticide on May 15th in Columbus, 2 weeks earlier, May 1st in Cincinnati, and 2 weeks later, May 30th in Cleveland. So we have Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland kind of diagonally across the state. This calendar date's not very reliable. If it's a really warm spring, Cincinnati could be way further ahead, and they've missed kind of that window for if something that we want to control chemically, we've kind of missed that window. Or even if we're doing cultural practices, planting dates or that sort of thing, the calendar really can lead us wrong. And so at OSU here in Ohio, we have moved to a growing degree day calendar that guides a lot of the chemical and other integrated pest management practices that we recommend here in the state. So we're going to talk about this calendar, how it was developed, how you can access that calendar and use it, maybe kind of think about how you would adapt it for your purposes. So you can actually, if you want to, you can go on your device, probably not that easy on your computer right now, but you can search for GDD and OSU. That stands for Growing Degree Day, and put a space in there, OSU. And it'll pull up this calendar, which unfortunately for you works only for zip codes in Ohio, but I'm going to talk about some ways you kind of do some hacks to still use this calendar. So the default is today's date, but you can put past dates in, and then, as I said, any zip code in the state of Ohio. So we're going to talk about what that calendar looks like and how you can use it. But first, let's talk about the person who developed that calendar for Ohio, Dr. Dan Herms, who used to be the chair of the entomology department here at OSU. He's now the head of research at Davy Tree in Kent, Ohio, and all over the country. But Dan had this fascination with phenology. He had done a lot of work both at Dow Gardens in Michigan, and when he came to Ohio as a faculty member in entomology at Sechrist Arboretum. And so Dan was in charge of integrated pest management at Dow Gardens. So he needed to know all the landscape pests that were active, how to manage them. And he wanted to know, what plant indicators can I use? What bloom time can I use to give me a heads up? Oh, I need to be thinking about this pest because this plant is blooming, right? Much easier than going around and trying to, for most of us, we're not entomologists, tracking all those pests and what stage they're in. We're able to correlate those pest stages with bloom time. So we know that when PJM rhododendron is in bloom, that correlates with a certain pest that's active, and we can use the calendar to make those pest management reminders to go out and look for pests. So the key premise of this calendar is that the development rate of plants and insects are both temperature dependent. And so if it's a warm spring or a warm season, then our plants are blooming faster, right? We're kind of moving from one plant to the next to the next. And insect development is following those air temperatures as well. Or if it's a cold spring, everything kind of puts the brakes on, plant bloom slows down, and so does insect development. And so that's why we can use one to predict the other. That's not the case with mammals and birds, right? Our babies don't grow faster in the summer. There is something to say about ambient temperature and egg development in birds, but birds aren't, growing feathers faster in the summer versus, so the rate of development doesn't change from season to season based on the temperature. So we can't as reliably plug mammal and bird events into our calendar. So we are focused just on insects and plants. So as I mentioned, honeybees are a little bit different because as we know, that hive, that's the amazing thing about this organism, this hive is able to hold the temperature consistent no matter the air temperature. So they're burning those nectar reserves, that honey in there to generate heat to keep the hive alive through the winter. And so development is happening. It doesn't matter so much about the outside temperature. Of course, that helps keep the colony warm, but they're not, developing faster in summer. That is going from egg to larva to pupa to adult versus in winter because they're able to regulate their own heat. So we don't have honeybee stages on our calendar because we can't really plug that in. It's one of those, it depends, right? It depends on your colony, on their ability to regulate the colony, the temperatures there inside the colony. But we can definitely track those that bee forage, the plants. Our calendar has just trees and shrubs, but I'll talk about some ways that you can kind of create your own calendar with other plants that you're interested in, perennials or woodland bulbs. And so we're definitely interested in those forage plants and what our honeybees are feeding on and bringing back to the colony. So here we are back at the calendar, and because it's so early in the season, so I put a zip code in and a January date. What happens with the calendar is that everything zeroes out in January. We start with 0 heat units or growing degree day units. So growing degree day is a measure of accumulated heat. And in January, we clear the slate. We say that there are 0 growing degree day units, GDD units on January 1. So if I put this zip code in and it defaults out to today's date or this, I put January 3rd in, I say, show me the calendar, and it drops me in to this view. And I have 2 different screens I'm going to show you. So here we are in Portsmouth. I put Portsmouth because I thought, well, if I'll go as far south as I can. For some of you who are close to the Ohio border, this will be a little more easily usable. So here in Portsmouth here's January 25th, which is for tomorrow, there's only 1 growing degree day that has accumulated. So that's a heat unit. It doesn't mean 1 warm day or 1 24-hour period. It means 1 heat unit, and we'll talk about how those units are calculated. So here I went to last year to give you a more practical example of how this calendar will look if you go to it. So again, I put that zip code in. I put March 23rd of last year. The calendar is going to drop me here. It's going to drop me here into the middle. So here we are on this date in this location. And what's to the left is what's already happened. Okay, in New Boston. You might know New Boston. I don't. And then to the right is what is yet to happen. The number up here in the corner is the growing degree day associated with that event. So here we have Bradford Callery pear in full bloom, around 164 growing degree days. So remember, that's a measure of accumulated heat. We started with 0 in January. And for every day that has an average temperature above 50, we accumulate a few heat units. The really great thing about this phenology calendar is that you don't have to remember how things are calculated, and you don't have to memorize the sequence of what blooms when, because it's all there on the calendar. So what has already happened here on this date in March of last year, what's about to happen. And notice that we use, well, I guess these are just full bloom. We use first bloom and full bloom as our indicators. And then we also have insect and mite pests mostly on this calendar. Okay. So let me go back here because I cut this off. So view full calendar. This is just that first screen, right? Drops me in what's already happened, what's about to happen. I don't know how fast, but it's coming soon, right? I can't predict the weather tomorrow or 2 days from now or next week, but I know those events are still to come. If I click on view full calendar, it drops me into this view. So I want you to imagine Dan Herms, the originator of this calendar, there at Dow Gardens with his notebook, looking around. He's this amazing entomologist, also horticulturalist. He knows these plants, he knows these insects, and he's writing down what's blooming today, what's just in first bloom, and what's in full bloom, and what insect eggs have hatched, larvae have pupated, pupae have matured into adults, adults have emerged. So he's writing all these things down, flipping the notebook the next day. Okay, what's blooming today? What insect events are happening? So that he's creating kind of this scroll of the first event that we track, first bloom of silver maple, and all the plants, and these are woody plants, trees and shrubs, and select pests that are on this calendar. So it's this sequence, this scroll of events, and so really imagine Dan out there taking these notes, creating this scroll. So when we go from this screen and we click on view full calendar, it drops us in here. So here's this date, March 23rd of last year. How many growing degree days have accumulated? So how many heat units have accumulated? What's above the black bar is what's already happened. Well, Callery pears have already come into full bloom. Manchu cherry came into full bloom. Allegheny serviceberry is in first bloom. And then everything below the black bar is what is yet to happen. PJM rhododendron is coming into full bloom. We don't know exactly when. Korean spice viburnum coming into first bloom. We know the sequence, but we don't know when we'll get there. Okay. Just one more thing about the calendar that I wanted to point out is you can click on summary. So I'll bet some of you have used this calendar before. Maybe you have or have not used the summary function. Dave Lonis is our amazing webmaster, and he pulled together. So if I click on summary, I get this page. So again, this is that date that I put in. For New Boston on March 23rd of last year, we had that total accumulated heat here. And he shows us, I realize this print's pretty small, but he shows us the accumulated heat, the growing degree day units for the last 20 years, and then shows us the average. Just to give us a sense, are we faster this year? Are things warmer? Are they slower? How does this compare to that? I think it was 2012. That was 2012, this really super warm March that we had with 80-degree temperatures that threw everything ahead so fast. So that summary button, just something to keep in mind. It can be cool to kind of compare, because I don't know about you, I can't remember, was last year a fast spring, a slow spring? How about 2 springs ago or 5 springs ago? Well, here's how we can kind of compare. So a little bit of math, because I know you like math at this time of night, so do I. But and my room is getting darker. I don't have the best lighting in here, so hopefully you can still see me okay. A little bit of math. This is all we're going to do. And as I said, you don't have to calculate these numbers. The calendar does it for you, but I think it helps to understand how the numbers are calculated. So a degree day overview. So we have weather stations all across the state, as you do, I'm sure, part of the USDA system. And they're taking in all kinds of weather data, wind speed, soil temperature, including air temperature. So I'm really interested in those daily air temperatures. That's what we use to calculate growing degree days. So it's a measure of accumulated heat. So we take our average daily temperature, so the high plus the low, divided by 2, minus 50, which is our base temperature, and that gives us the degree days that have accumulated. Okay, so remember, everything zeroes out in January, and then for every day that has an average daily temperature over 50, then those heat units accumulate. So Portsmouth only has 1 heat unit. That doesn't mean 1 warm day. That means 1 little solitary heat unit that's waiting for more warm days to be added to slowly over late winter and early spring. Okay, so in this example, on March 6th, we had no warm days above 50-degree average daily temperature until March 6th. March 6th, we had a high of 60, a low of 56. And remember, our base is 50. It's always going to be 50. That's our human assumption that above 50 degrees, development happens, and below 50 degrees, development doesn't happen. That's not necessarily true, but that's still the assumption that we're making that makes the calendar work, okay? So we're taking our daily average, the high plus the low, divided by 2. We subtract our base temperature, 50, and we get 8 degree day units that have accumulated at the end of March 6th. Okay, that doesn't mean there have been 8 warm days or 8 days with over 51 degrees. It means we have 8 degree day units, right? Scientists call them that. They could call them avocados. It just is a measure of accumulated heat, and we just have to get used to it. So for a lot of people, that's like awkward. I don't understand what is a growing degree day. It's a measure of accumulated heat, okay? The next day, March 7th, we had a high of 70, a low of 40. Well, when those buds start to push out, when those oak leaves are as big as a squirrel's ear, but then we get a cold day, they don't go back into the bud, right? Those leaves don't go back into the stem. Everything just kind of holds still until the next warm day. So we don't use any temperature in our calculation that's below our base. So here on March 7th, we have a high of 70 and a low of 40. We don't use 40. Right? Because that's below our base. So we use 70, the high, plus 50, not 40. We use the base. That gives us our daily, here's our daily average, our high plus our low, oops, we use the base, divided by 2, gives us 60 minus our base unit. And now we have 10 growing degree day units that have accumulated on March 7th. We go back to yesterday, we pull in those 8 units, and now at the end of March 7th, we have a total of 18 degree day units, okay? So that's how those numbers accumulate through the season. If on March 8th, it's below 50 degrees for another week or 2 or 3, we just stay at 18, and that's how sometimes it feels. Things aren't happening very fast until we get another day that the average daily temperature is above 50 degrees, above our base. Okay. If we were in a room together, I could tell like who is like the math fan and loves this and who is like, I do not get it. I've got questions. Hopefully you can put questions into the chat box. But as we go, I'm hoping things make even more sense. So let's flash ahead to April 7th of 2021. It was kind of this is what happens when we have warm nights and warm days. Okay, so throughout, let's say for you, it's probably, I don't know when things start to warm up for you, maybe late February is when you start to get daily temperatures averaging above 50. So it starts off really slow. Maybe you add 5 units, you add 8 units, you add 2 units. But then as we go through the spring, we get warm days and warm nights, and those degree day units, those totals really accelerate. So here on April 7th of 2021, this is an actual example, we had a low of 57 and a high of 83. So our average daily temperature was 70, minus our base, that gives us 20 degree day units in one day. And early in the season, for you, February, for me, more like late March or April, it could take 3 or 4 weeks to get to 20 degree days that have accumulated. We start with 1, we add on 2, we may add on 5, we wait for 2 weeks. And so this is just an example that shows you what can happen when we get those high daytime temperatures and also some warmer nighttime temperatures. Okay. All right. I didn't think about the bee. Oh, I guess I don't have to spell. They can't spell the barking. I was going to spell barking for you. That may be a call for my husband. I can hear a dog outside. Okay, so back to the calendar. Remember, we have this scroll that Dan helped to illuminate what blooms first and what blooms next and what blooms next. So everything cancels out to 0 on January 1st. And then this sequence stays the same. We don't have to memorize these numbers. These are average degree days that are associated with this event. So for silver maple to come into first bloom, the average degree day is 34. That's going to hold true from year to year. Maybe next year it's 36 because it's an average. You're looking outside, it's 32, but it's pretty close to that 34. So these events, silver maple in first bloom, Cornelian cherry dogwood in first bloom, silver maple in full bloom, this sequence is going to be the same from year to year. How quickly we get through it, that just depends on the temperatures, but the sequence is going to hold the same. You can kind of see that here, this white pine weevil is in bold. That indicates that it's not a plant, right? So our insects and our mites are in bold. And for any of these events, if you click on them, you can see what a Japanese pieris looks like or see what white pine weevil does. There's not a lot of information there, but at least it gets you a picture or something of each of those events. Okay. All right, so I was getting ready to 1 year. This is 2016, which seems like forever ago, right? With the pandemic screwing all our sense of time up. I was traveling from here in Stark County to a program to teach phenology outside of Cincinnati. So I'm about 4 hours driving time north of Cincinnati. So Cincinnati can have lots of beautiful bloom, lots of things happening, and it's still pretty gray and cold here where I am in Northeast Ohio. So before I left for this program, I put in my zip code and to see where we were at. We were at 352 growing degree days. So remember, that's what has accumulated heat-wise since January. To the left here, what's already happening, my red chokecherry was in full bloom, Japanese Caria in full bloom. Now, I don't have to have these plants close by, but that's what's happening in my region. Anything that's kind of in my neighborhood or in my town or places where the temperatures are about the same, these events are happening. What's after this box is what's about to happen. Double file viburnum coming into first bloom, smooth crabgrass, seedlings emerging, etc. So I put here. So here we are in Massillon. I was at 352 growing degree days. So red chokecherry in bloom. Here's the fruit later in the season for this chokecherry, chokeberry. Wait, chokeberry. Yeah, chokecherry is a prunus too. And so here I was going to Glendale outside of Cincinnati. So I put their zip code in. They're at 560 growing degree days. Things are cooking down there, right? Bloom is happening. They have mountain laurel in bloom. For me here in Northeast Ohio, that's several weeks away on the same calendar day, right? And so we have this phenological wave, which you have in Kentucky as well, starting from the southern parts of the state up through the northern parts of the state, where bloom and heat is kind of making its way north across the state. So here, if we look, here's Ohio, here you are down here. And I've done a lot of teaching with beekeepers with phenology for beekeepers in surrounding states. So it works really nicely for, beekeepers in Pennsylvania who are close to Youngstown. They can put in that zip code. In West Virginia, they're close here, maybe Marietta. You're maybe close to Cincinnati or close to Portsmouth. In Indianapolis, they could put in Columbus. They're about the same, same region phenologically. And so there are ways to use that Ohio calendar without being able to put in your Kentucky zip code. So since plant and insect development are both temperature dependent, we can use these plant events to track degree days. So if we want to know how many degree days have accumulated, we could look at what's in bloom and have that resource of how many growing degree days are associated with that event. But also to predict what insects are active. So to create this biological calendar to predict pest activity and schedule our pest management appointments. Now, maybe you're thinking, why do I care about pest management? Well, Dan was the integrated pest management manager of Dow Gardens. And so that was really his lens when he was developing this calendar. Which pests are active and what plants are blooming that can tell me what I should be looking for, right? Or help other people know what to scout for. So there are different ways to use the calendar, and we'll get to those in just a minute, that don't involve pests. But for example, we can add pests onto the calendar. So this is the viburnum leaf beetle, which I'm pretty darn sure you don't have in Kentucky, and I hope you never have it. It's an introduced beetle that with larvae here in the underside of viburnum leaves that can defoliate native viburnums. Those beetles drop down to the ground, they pupate, and then they emerge as adults later in the summer. And if any leaves were able to push out again on that viburnum, the adults come and strip it. So it can be really damaging to our native viburnums. So we were able to watch the egg masses, watch for larvae hatching, egg hatch for viburnum leaf beetle, and then add this event to the calendar. So unfortunately, we've added several pests, right? We've added Asian longhorn beetle and emerald ash borer. Most recently, the spotted lanternfly to the calendar as new pests emerge. So again, we're tracking first bloom and full bloom. What does that mean? This is important if you're going to create your own calendar, and I'm going to show you how in just a minute. First bloom, the definition needs to be the same. So the definition of first bloom is when the first flower in a cluster or the first flower on the whole plant. So the first viburnum flower in this cluster or the first star magnolia on your whole tree, when that opens to expose its sexual parts, its reproductive parts, that's first bloom. Our definition of full bloom is when 1 out of 20 buds is still closed. So 1 out of 20 in this cluster, or 1 out of 20 buds on your star magnolia. So that's our definition. So there are lots of ways to use phenology. If you know phenology, you probably know that serviceberry is the poster child of phenology. It got its name because when, in the old days, we couldn't dig graves in the winter. We had to wait to bury our friends and family who died over the winter until the ground had thawed. And the itinerant preacher would come to our little holler to give the service for those loved ones who died. And so when the service berry was in bloom, that was an indicator that the soil had thawed enough that we could dig the grave and hold the service. So that's what we think of with serviceberry. Phenology is used a lot in orchards and fruit pest management, small fruits as well. So what stage is the plant in and what practice is associated with that? So maybe it's an oil spray, or maybe there's pesticide that needs to go down, or maybe it's scouting for certain pests. But a lot of fruit guides that Extension Services produce use those phenological phases of those plants. Here in Ohio, we have folks growing hops. It's not a crop that we have a lot of history with. We can't ask Grandpa or Grandma how they manage different hops pests. And so these hops growers came together. They created a strategy to observe their hops for different pests, and they associated what pests they were seeing with our degree day calendar. So they were able to, here's the growing degree day number. So what's happening right now? I put my zip code in, how many degree days have accumulated, and what are they seeing 90% emergence, of a certain pest or development of their plant. Beekeepers love phenology because you're tied into the honey flow, right? You need to know what your bees are bringing back. You want to know what pollen they're gathering, and this sequence of bloom is a way to kind of expand your knowledge of what plants are resources for your bees, where those might be around you in that the central place foraging idea, and maybe how to add some of that habitat to fill in some gaps. So we know the bees want both pollen and nectar. Maybe you're trying to harvest a varietal honey, so you kind of need to know what's in bloom. Are the blueberries in bloom? And is that what the bees are bringing back? If you were trying to harvest that certain kind of honey. I do a lot with bee identification, and our bees are definitely very seasonal. Our queen bees out early in the spring. We have other spring bees like mason bees and polyester bees, some late season bees like the specialist who needs ironweed to feed their young. So we can use phenology to kind of predict what bees we might see. Are we seeing the queen bumblebees hunting for nest spaces? When I see Virginia bluebells in bloom, I'm thinking, wow, this is kind of key time. I should be out there seeing a lot of queen bumblebees looking for those nesting sites, maybe also foraging for pollen and nectar to get that first generation started. Here's our polyester bees. They build little solitary tunnels in the ground for their offspring. And if I'm looking for polyester bees, maybe to photograph or to collect some samples, I'm looking here in Ohio for star magnolia in bloom. Maybe the same correlation if you have the same species of polyester bee where you are. And 1 year's worth of observation would tell you, what is in bloom? What are you seeing? That species of bee and what plants is in bloom. You make note of that, and that should hold true next year if you were good about taking those observations. What's in first bloom? What's in full bloom? To really pinpoint it. I mentioned specialist bees. These are bees that are pollen specialists. Honeybees are pollen generalists, and bumblebees too. They can go to lots of different plants and gather that forage. But we have about a third of all bees that are specialists. They can only go to certain plants to gather pollen for their offspring. So this specialist doesn't have a good name, but it's a specialist on ironweed, this little Melissodes. She only goes to ironweed to collect pollen, which happens to be white, right? See her pollen pockets, all full of white ironweed pollen. Takes that back underground to provision cells for her offspring. Other ways we can use phenology, we talked about those landscape pest strategies. So if you're trying to you want to try to manage eastern tent caterpillars, which can defoliate your fruit trees. Maybe you just planted an orchard, and you need to know the timing, as our calendar will tell you. When forsythia is in bloom, that's when eastern tent caterpillar eggs hatch, and before then they start to make those webby nests in the crotches of branches. So we can use the calendar, we can use the bloom to be reminding us, oh, I better go out, time to start to look for those webs. When they're small, easy to remove with a gloved hand. Black cherry is an indicator that our Ohio Department of Agriculture uses when they're spraying for gypsy moth management here in the state. They're using BT, and to manage gypsy moth, they have to get the larvae when they're very small. They're most susceptible, and there are also fewer impacts on other caterpillars in forests. And so they use our calendar because they're spraying potentially in many different counties across that span of Ohio. Different things are happening, so they're using our calendar to say, okay, is black cherry in bloom? They've identified that as the prime time to spray for gypsy moth with BT. And so if they're going to Licking County, they have a feel for, okay, I can use the calendar, figure out when that cherry is in bloom, and what the date of that application should be. When red buckeye is in bloom, that's when we expect to see hummingbirds return to the state. As I said, birds aren't as tied to that temperature for development, and with climate change, we're seeing some of their migration influenced more by what's in bloom as they migrate north, and they're also looking at day length. And so our hummingbirds may get to Ohio, and the red buckeye's already in bloom, unfortunately, with climate changes. For creating pollinator habitat, we want bloom throughout the season. I love this publication from Cornell that talks about early, mid, and late resources for lots of different bees. And so we can select plants to kind of span that season in bloom. our bees are flying a lot further than our yard, but it is a nice way to add some of those plants in to kind of create that full season of forage. And of course, from a landscape perspective, we love that idea. Can we have a landscape that has something in bloom all the time? I'm a weed fan from way back, so this is me along that gravel road up in the top of the mountain in the Laurel Highlands. I'm picking coltsfoot and in the earliest weed out there blooming. So I love weed phenology, and a lot of our bees are using those weeds. They're using coltsfoot, dandelion, our clovers. They're using purple dead nettle as great forage resources. So it's good to know what's blooming when, which weeds are good guys. Just check the time and take a quick sip. So we're going to take a super quick jog through the season. I think I'm going to skip some of the images. So if you go to the handout, there are going to be more images than I'm going to mention just because we don't have a lot of time. But I want to kind of give you a feel for what bees are foraging on when. So I mentioned skunk cabbage, really that first native wildflower to bloom. We also see alders very early in the season. We know that plants that have catkins, even though they're not showy or fragrant flowers, they're still really appealing to bees, especially when there's not much else in bloom. So bees are visiting alder, they're visiting ash and oak and other plants that have catkins. So be thinking about those wind-pollinated plants as well. Maple's really great early in the season. First our silver maple and then red maples, both a nectar and pollen source. Cornelian cherry dogwood, it's not a native tree, so I didn't mention this, that our calendar has only trees and shrubs. It has native and non-native plants. And just to reiterate, it's not full of plants that are only, all the plants on the calendar are not pollinator forage plants. Okay, because it wasn't developed for pollinator forage. So here's Cornelian cherry dogwood, which is actually a really great plant for pollinators. Here's a honeybee on here for her pockets full of this pollen. It's a non-native ornamental. You probably don't have many, maybe one. It looks like a giant, tree forsythia, maybe in a cemetery or at a school or in your yard. But when it's blooming, lots and lots of bees are going to be on it. Now, we don't have weeds or perennials on the calendar, but bees just love, I mentioned purple dead nettle and also henbit, those members of the mint family, really early season forage plants. A lot of our willows, so willows have separate male and female plants. Bees will visit both. The males have pollen, sometimes a little nectar. The females plants have mostly nectar, sometimes a little pollen. So really great early season pollen sources for bees. Dandelions and mustards, again, these are not on the calendar, but we're just kind of walking through that bee resource season. Those spring yellows, that's when your colony should be really expanding, right? There's lots of resources out there. It's around the time that Bradford Callery pear is in bloom. Not such a great bee resource, but lots of flowers out there. Some little bees are using those flowers. But that is an indicator for European pine sawfly. If you've ever seen those, they look like caterpillars, but they're actually sawfly larvae eating your mugo pine. And you're trying to think about when the eggs are hatching, when you can easily kill those little larvae. It's around the time that Callery pear is in bloom. Redbuds, really great native tree for lots of different kinds of bees, and also an indicator plant for there, I didn't correct myself, for spongy moth. So the name has changed. I think I said gypsy moth earlier. So spongy moth eggs hatch around the time that redbud is in bloom. So it can be a good way to monitor looking for egg masses and those little caterpillars. Apples and crab apples, really wonderful for lots of different bees. I think Cornell identified something like 120 different bee species that forage on apples and crab apples. So a really great a pollen and nectar source, very open, those flowers, very available. Great for mason bees, lots of other bees. And this is actually from a Cornell bulletin that talks about, so if you have an orchard or you have a few fruit trees, what is in bloom and which bees are active when those flowers are in bloom. So we're trying to have bees in the orchard when flowers are just blooming, all the way through when there's full bloom on those plants. So how can we invite that sequence of bees to our wild bees to the orchard? And that's from this Wild Pollinators of Eastern Apple Orchards. It's a really great publication. They also have this chart that talks about, what's in bloom. Here's our apple trees, and then which forage plants are also available on the farm. And so we don't want to compete with apples. So we may want to have some things that are earlier than apple, and then some plants that are blooming after apple as a way to keep the bees in the orchard, having them, set up shop and be there available for next year for pollination. Coming through. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Here's a study that Dr. Reed Johnson in our department put together. He collected pollen from bees that were foraging for just these 3 weeks in late April, early May. And the idea was to see what bees are foraging on when corn was planted, because there was an issue of some pesticides on corn seed, and the concern was, what are bees bringing back? What are they foraging on? And so they collected this pollen, sorted it by color, and then stained and identified those species. And we don't really have time to talk about this, but some of these great bee plants, dandelion mustard, other herbaceous plants, and how they kind of change through the season. So here, early, uh, late April to early May, we have more of the ash trees, right? That wind pollinated plant, moving into more rosaceous plants, so our apples and hawthorns and others. Some really great research from Reed Johnson. Then we're at tulip poplars in bloom, our native, this great native nectar source. Basswood in bloom. It's kind of the last tree that we think about that's native, that's great for honeybees. They just buzz with honeybees when they're blooming. You might have lindens in your neighborhood, which bloom around the same time. This is actually a good indicator plant for the emergence of Japanese beetle adults. And we know that the first Japanese beetle adults that we see are scouts. And they're sending invitations to their siblings to come out and come to your yard. I found this great raspberry plant, come and here at Joe's garden. And if we can capture and destroy some of those scouts, we can keep the population down somewhat in our landscape. And so we're either using the calendar, or we're thinking about little leaf lindens in bloom as a time to get ready for that Japanese beetle emergence. Our calendar kind of gives out there. We only track bloom through this time in summer. Kind of Rose of Sharon first bloom is kind of the end of our calendar. And that's because plants that bloom in summer into fall tend to rely more on day length than on that accumulated heat. But we can see here for magnolia scale egg hatch around 1,938 growing degree days. So remember, we started with 0 in January, and we've added a little at a time and then a lot at a time to have this measure of degree day. Okay. Some ways that you can translate this into what you do as a beekeeper, as a naturalist. I keep a phenology journal, just a little moleskin notebook that I carry with me. It's a perpetual journal. I don't have to write this out every year. But what I've done is on every right page of this notebook, I've written every event in the calendar. So first bloom of silver maple, and then first bloom of Cornelian cherry dogwood, and then full bloom of silver maple. Turn the page, I'm writing all these events out, either first bloom or full bloom. I have my own little code there. So I only have to do that one time because I don't have any calendar dates, right? And then every time I notice something like sugar maple bloom is not on our calendar, and I wanted to know where does it fit. So when I see something that I'm interested in, I note when it's blooming and I put it next to the plant that's also blooming, or by the growing degree days, what it correlates with. Okay, so first bloom of garlic mustard, yellow rocket in full bloom, my yellow epimedium, a sweet little introduced perennial in my garden, sugar maple full bloom. So a way that you could keep track, adding your own plants that are of interest to you. Others use something like the Naturalist Notebook. It is calendar based, but you could, when you're making observation, taking notes, you could tie into Kentucky is tracking those growing degree days somewhere. You just have to find out where. And I'm sorry that I couldn't seem to find an easy way for you to, maybe someone in the group here tonight knows. I mean, you could write in those growing degree days when you're noting that plant bloom or insect activity observation in something like this calendar. We have an awesome beekeeper in Ohio, Dick Mullet, and he is really into phenology. He tracked the growing degree day for a lot of plant events, and then he correlated those with his honeybee practices. So when is he cleaning the hives? When is he seeing capped drones? When is he adding his supers? So a way to kind of use the bloom time to alert him to what might be happening with his hives. You can create your own calendar by going back to photographs. You have the dates. You could look up the location right here in Ohio. We could put the zip code in. We could find that correlated growing degree day. So add to our own calendar. So here I was in Worcester when this Stewartia was in bloom. It's not on our calendar, but I knew what date I was there. So I could put in the Worcester zip code and the date. I found it was at 867 degree days. And so that gives me an idea of when Stewartia would be in bloom in future years. Okay. I think I'm only 2 minutes over. So I know that was a lot of information and not very much time, but I hope there were some practical ways that you discovered that you could use something like the phenology calendar for your work as a beekeeper, as a naturalist, as a gardener. The sequence of plants on our calendar will really work well for you in Kentucky. I mean, you will have some plants that we can't grow here, but many of our plants, are plants that are in your forest, in your landscapes. And so very, very transferable to having your own kind of calendar. So remember, the sequence of events is the same. You're going to have those events occur a lot faster, a lot sooner than they will here in Ohio. But you could still kind of start with that framework and then plug in other plants or other insect events that interest you. I'm so happy to say that we had success. There was a tiny, tiny little bit of growling, but everybody's calm now. And my Zoom mates didn't crash the party. Again, here's the handout that I prepared for you with all of those slides that we just went through. It's a go.osu.edu /KYBs. So you have to do the http:// part. So this whole thing, maybe somebody can throw that in the, oh, I see you have a weather site there that somebody put in. Thank you. So anyway, that'll get you to the handout. If you have other questions, you can follow up with me. I'm at ellsworth.2@osu.edu. I love phenology, so you're not bugging me if you send me a question or a photograph or a plant. That's a lot more fun than some of the paperwork that we have to do, right, April and Macy? And then my website, blab.osu.edu, we have lots and lots of webinars recorded and housed there. We have other programs coming up, more in person now, I'm happy to say, but a lot of great resources there as well. So thank you so much. I'm going to click on your weather site too. And some of you may know Boone Arboretum. Chris's last name is just blown out of my head. But anyway, there's some good phenology demonstration that was happening there at Boone County.
All right, thank you, Denise. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, go ahead and put those in the chat box, please. And Denise, also wanted to say I have a little Zoom buddy.
Aw.
So that's John Wayne.
Mine are too big to pick up and show.
I have a
There's one
bloodhound.
here and there's one there.
Yeah, I have a bloodhound in here too, and a red healer, but they've actually
Oh,
been asleep and
oh,
been really good tonight. So for
nice.
everyone who attended the very first session, they got to hear them bellowing very
Aw.
loud. Yeah. Oh, it was quiet the entire evening until right when I had to talk, and then of course
Right.
you know how that goes.
Oh, I do see on this growing degree day. So the only thing we'd need to see about using that Kentucky side and translating it to what we do in Ohio is what base unit you're using. And I just clicked on, but I'm not quickly seeing. And because remember, we use the base temperature of 50, and a lot of other sites and studies use different base units. So if the growing degree day calculation uses 60, for example, it's not directly translatable by using just that number.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions, but if anyone does have questions after we end this evening, do feel free to reach out and let us know. If you ask us, and we'll get with Denise, because this is the first time I've actually heard this really great presentation, and I really like it a lot. So thank you so much. A lot of wonderful information, and I know a lot of people will have great things to take away from it. So,
Awesome.
Grant, did you have a question or anything?
I'm sorry. So Grant put in a link with the growing degree day maps for Kentucky counties, and it is growing degree day 50 is the base. I just saw it now. Oh yeah, the default base is 50. So those numbers would be translatable to what you're seeing on the Ohio calendar. So that could be a really great way to, I don't know what other plants, they have corn on there. But anyway, yeah, great. Thanks for putting that in there.